Welcome back to the 255th episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, including how the EV policies that Biden put in place are actually kind of more muddled than people thought, how the Supreme Court may rule in favor of Starbucks and against some of these administrative agencies, and talking about the transportation department and how it's actually not in the news as much, and maybe how that's a good thing. And of course, we'll end today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive and ready to take on the day. Now, that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump in to our daily debate. So, if you had your options right now, you're going in for a new car, they're all the exact same price. Are you going for a gas? Are you going for a hybrid? Are you going for a full EV? I'm really interested. If people put down their opinions down there, maybe we could see with a wide span of people whether or not EVs are as popular as they are presumed to be. You know, we've heard conversations about it from the Biden administration, from lots of other newspapers or just commentariats in general, that EVs are surging. And of course, they are really popular. I mean, I'm seeing more of them on the road. But are they as popular as the perception seems to be among the commentariat class? I don't know. Maybe not so much. Maybe it's just because of the area they live in. Because I'm telling you now, I'm still in a pretty big city in Tennessee right now, but I'll tell you, not as many EVs as when I'm up north in Virginia when I was there a year ago. So love to hear what you guys have to say. Throw it down in the comment section. Let's jump into our first article. So for both of our first ones come from the WashingtonExaminer. The headline for this first one reads, Biden EV policies leave government chasing its own tail. So I've gone back and forth on this proposal or this change in tax code that the Biden administration was putting out there, because I think that if you're going to do any interference in the market, then tax incentives are, I would say, preferable. I feel like they're less heavy-handed. There's optionality to them. It's basically encouraging behavior, but not saying you have to do it, so on and so forth. It's still a direct interference in the market because it's subsidizing something, meaning that the companies that are producing these cars can say, oh, well, hey, we know that the Biden administration is going to give out a $7,000 tax credit whenever someone buys a new EV, so we don't actually have to keep our costs down on the sticker price. We can actually raise them a little bit. We can kind of naturally inflate them, because we know that people are instantly doing the math when they're buying this car. They're like, oh, it's $7,000 cheaper. So guess what? If you raise the sticker price by $2,000, you're still making an extra $2,000. You could sell it for that $2,000 less, but everybody else in their head's like, oh, well, you know, even though it went up by $2,000, I'm still saving $5,000 because of this tax credit, you know, compared to if I had bought it last year. So this sort of thing is obviously what happens when you subsidize something from the government, direct government intervention in the market. We've seen it happen with college tuition. So when we hear about it again, you start to really question, okay, is this actually a market that can survive without these subsidies? Because we know that Chevrolet, Ford, they have outwardly stated that they're probably going to take losses on these EV sales for the first few years until they can get the manufacturing to be a little bit cheaper, until they can get the market segment, I don't want to say larger, but they've been able to tap into a market segment, or at least the market has become more aware of the capabilities of some of these EV cars. So we know that they're taking losses for this, and now they're being subsidized by the government. So is this something that's actually going to survive without government subsidy? That's always one of the questions you need to ask when the government's directly subsidizing something. And I think I brought this up a long time ago when they brought the CHIPS Act forward, which is, I like the idea behind the CHIPS Act. And I also like the idea behind trying to make our infrastructure more robust here in order to compete with China. But I also brought up multiple questions, multiple different problems with that. One of them is how we're actually trying to exclude China, and they may build up their own infrastructure in response to this rather than trying to cooperate with us, which means they could actually be more, independent without any other outside nations providing certain tech. That's a point that we don't need to go into here. The other part of it is the government subsidizing this industry for national security purposes, which could be very well justified, and you're going to not catch much flack from me on the China side, but is it going to artificially inflate the sector so much that it actually can't survive without government intervention? And that's a serious question that we need to address whenever we think about the government getting involved in something or spending tax dollars on it, or just giving it money. I mean, would the military-industrial complex be so successful without the government giving it money? Maybe. I mean, they're pretty darn good at making weapons, and we sell them all over the world. These American firms do, so maybe they would survive without government contracts. Maybe not. And that's a serious question. Should an entire industry just be propped up by government money? Now, like I said, tax credits are one of the least heavy-handed ways to go about this, but it's a serious conversation that needs to come up. And that's exactly what the Washington Examiner dives into here. So let's read one of the first quotes. Quote, "At first glance, this sounds like a boon for everyone involved. Consumers, they get their deduction right away, and dealers might get made whole by the government. However, the administration is playing with fire, that is the supply and demand. One need look no further than higher education to see the pitfalls of this approach. Colleges and universities set prices they thought people could afford. In an effort to incentivize people to get college degrees, the government subsidized student loans on a massive scale. This drove up demand to meet it. Colleges raised prices, knowing the government would continue to subsidize their prices, and it's a seamlessly bottomless catch of student loans. This resulted in exorbitantly high tuition costs nationwide. It has also resulted in tens of millions of dollars in unpaid student loan debt. This problem has become so pressing that the Biden administration continues to try to forgive outstanding loans unconstitutionally." So whether or not you agree with that sentiment here presented by the Washington Examiner, they also raise other questions. So they kind of outlined what I was talking about here. They kind of give the perspective about where the government should stand on these sort of things, why a direct subsidy, a direct intervention by the government, even in the most light-handed, the softest touch, the gentlest pat on the bottom in order to encourage certain behavior, how that is not even going to end well. But then there's also the little catch that they put into some of these bills. So like we laid out at the very beginning, if a company who is selling these EVs says, hey, we can raise our prices a little bit because some of that cost is actually going to be eaten up by the government, then the government's going to be there like, hey, we're not stupid. We understand how this works. So we're actually going to put a particular cap on this credit. So then they're trying to make another policy to address an issue that is created or possibly created by a policy they had put out first. Quote, "Because the price cap applies only to MSRP, manufacturers may be forced into implementing several hidden fees. If the sticker price must be below a certain number, but the cost of doing business is too high, hidden fees will be the only way many manufacturers can stay solvent amidst the Biden administration's assault on this market. More likely, manufacturers may pivot back to gas-powered vehicles or even hybrid EVs." So I added the hybrid EVs part, but they ended their quote at gas-powered vehicles. They do mention that Hertz is selling off a lot of their EVs. So this is a serious risk, and it's a serious contention that you have to think about. So if manufacturers are told, hey, your cars are going to get tax credits, they're really happy. And then they hear, but if the sticker price is above a certain thing, meaning you're just artificially jacking up the price, essentially, at least that's the idea behind it, then you actually can't have your cars apply for this anymore. It will fall into like a luxury category or above an affordable category. So we're not going to subsidize that because we want to subsidize the affordable cars. Well, guess what? Then you have two things. You have the one group of people who are sitting there saying, well, okay, hey, we can't actually get it down to this price point naturally. So we're going to have to adjust the sticker price to actually make it more affordable, or at least appear more affordable, fall within this category, so it will be more attractive to customers. But then there's going to be some hidden fee structure in there, which is going to piss off customers even more. And guess what? I mean, Biden trying to get rid of junk fees, that probably doesn't look good for him at the end of the day, when in order to get some of these cars sold, they're including certain junk fees in order to make sure they are breaking even. And then it could be directly attributed back to the policy that Biden put in place. Now, I think that may be a little bit unfair. People aren't going to make that direct connection. They're probably going to blame the car companies rather than Biden. But it's an interesting contention. And I think it's something that we need to seriously examine, because this is what happens when you start to have too much intervention in markets. You have one problem that you're trying to solve for. You put something in place which could cause another problem. So you add another layer to it. You add another rule. You add another stipulation. And eventually this can't stop. Eventually you can reach a place where, hey, all these rules, they interlock so perfectly that there's no loophole, there's no way around it, there's no thing that's actually bad about it. That's like a 1 in a million. That is even less than 1 in a million, because there's always going to be a loophole. There's always going to be something that isn't properly covered by all these different rules and regulations that are laid out by the administration. There's going to be all this different fallout that is created from these sort of things when you have a legislator and an executive trying to work together to reach a very specific end, which, hey, they believe it's a very noble end. I think they have some argument there that having a more diverse set of cars on the road, having us not so reliant on one form of energy, even though almost all of the electricity that goes into these electric cars is powered by fossil fuels anyway. But at least from a strategic point of view, you could definitely make an argument to me that I would listen to about having more diverse energy sources, because we don't want to be beholden to an OPEC. We don't want to be beholden to an EPEC, whatever electronic producing countries in the future would be, or a hydrogen fuel. We don't want to be beholden to anybody else. We want to be independent. So having a diverse electricity grid where we get energy from lots of different sources is a great contention. Is this necessarily how you would get there? No. And even on the implementing side of trying to get more EVs into people's hands, it seems that they've started to run into some serious issues here as well. And all of this contrived tax credit nonsense, all of this contrived environmental, I don't want to say boondoggle, because there's definitely some serious contentions there. There's definitely evidence that we are dealing with a changing climate. And at the end of the day, it's not something we can just ignore. Is it going to be as bad as everybody predicts? No. Is it going to be as good as some people say? Oh, they're like, oh yeah, no, we'll just figure it out. No. Okay, our ecosystem is so complicated. And to pretend as though we can truly understand every single thing, I don't even think a computer could properly simulate every single factor that goes into certain weather aspects. And let's be clear, we have pretty good modeling systems, but those are short-term, not long-term, okay? So to pretend as though we can have all the answers now and that we can solve everything with one thing or another is naive, but that's not an excuse to not move forward. But when we do it this way, where we have all these contrived rules, where we have all this bureaucratic bloat, layer upon layer. The IRS is putting something in. The EPA is putting something in. The NLRB is worried about emissions here. And let's be clear, the NLRB does not do much with emissions. Just saying, listing off different administrative agencies that come off the top of my head. And also because the next article, which I was trying to transition to here, this idea of too much administrative bloat is becoming a serious issue that not only is going to confuse customers on this end with the EV tax credit stuff and possibly hurt manufacturers, but it's also just going to waste taxpayer dollars on the other end and strangle lots of different companies. And that's why the Supreme Court is taking up a case. So that's our second article, also from the Washington Examiner, with the headline reading, "The Supreme Court will rule for Starbucks against the administrative state." So for this one, I don't want to give the context all by myself, because let's be clear, I've been following this a little bit, but not as much as the EV credit thing. So I want to make sure that we have a solid foundation that the article lays out rather than me ranting for 3 minutes. Quote, "Under the Biden administration, With its overly pro-union bias, the National Labor Relations Board, which I'm just going to call the NLRB from now on, is the fact finder, the judge, and the jury in labor disputes subject to the NLRB Act of 1935. In oral arguments before the U.S. Supreme Court in Starbucks versus McKinney case on this Tuesday, a majority of the Supreme Court signaled that they will further roll back the power of the administrative state. The judges implied that they will rule that an administrative agency must have clear legislative language to support a determination they make. And okay, so this is really, really important because when a legislator is going about its business and it's either creating a new agency or normally when it's creating a new agency, they write out what its purview will be. And they normally write out what the process of writing a regulation will be like. They have a 30-day commenting period, so on and so forth. But they sometimes leave it very, very wide open. They leave the purview of that executive authority very wide open. And guess what? Guess who gets to make the rules, or at least make the rules and regulations and propose them, and then they go through a comment period. But when they make these rules, they're not actually obligated to change anything. They're supposed to take in people's comments. They're supposed to listen to their concerns and do something. I mean, like in theory, they should do something. That doesn't mean they absolutely have to. These administrative agencies can basically run on their own. They can create their own rules, and if it's not challenged in court, which a lot of them have been challenged in court, but if it's not challenged in court, then guess what? They have free reign. And this is vesting a lot of power in the executive. And that's why it is, I don't want to say scary, but that's why a lot of people who don't like big government find an issue with it. Because when it comes to actually creating laws and rules, if you just want to go beyond the simple term law, but if you want to use a really basic term, the rules of how we interact in a society, those rules, those dictates, the laws of the land are supposed to be put together and legislated. They should be signed. They should be created in the legislature. And then the executive is the one that acts them out. It should not be the executive branch actually creating these rules and regulations with basically no comments from Congress, no comments from the legislator. There's a little bit of input from the people, but even then they don't have to say anything. And the only check they have is the Supreme Court. So now the Supreme Court's they may actually have a chance. And this is my separations of power self, my too much power in the executive branch self that's coming out here. Yes, I know that I'm a little bit biased approaching this one, but I do believe there has been too much executive bloat over not only the course of my lifetime, but the late 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, all of the time period. We've had excessive amounts of use of the executive order. We've seen the executive expanding his power ever since Delano Roosevelt, mainly because of his bully pulpit that he's been able to use to his advantage in the public sphere to say, hey, I want this issue passed. The legislator's not actually doing what you, the people, told me to do, so now I'm going to put forward an executive action. I'm going to find a statute. I'm going to have my administrative agencies create these new rules and regulations out of nowhere, or at least start a panel, start a committee to look into it, and then 5 years later, we have a rule that affects maybe half of an entire industry that was never actually legislated upon. So these are serious concerns. And when you hear the Supreme Court saying, hey, we're going to put it back in the bottle, we're going to say the executive agency, guess what? You don't just have the ability to write any rule you want. It has to be laid out by the legislator. And I'm not going to deny that this can get very hairy, because then any single time that a executive agency needs to make a rule, they're going to have to say, hey, this is exactly where this power is created. They're going to have to point back to the legislator and say, this is exactly where we get our power to do so. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe that's a great thing. I'm not trying to hate on that. I'm just saying it's going to make things a little bit trickier. And also, I want to pose a counterfactual here, which is right now, a lot of these rules get struck down because they do not have explicit, they have taken on the role of a legislator, which the Supreme Court doesn't like because it violates the separation of the powers that should be vested in each branch of government. So they sometimes find workarounds in order to strike these things down, so on and so forth. And these people that are challenging them are saying, hey, this was not, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, this was not explicitly legislated anywhere. So where do they get this power from, so on and so forth? The Supreme Court comes up with a nice ruling, or maybe they agree with, yes, they weren't actually vested these powers. But then when someone gets into control of the Senate and the House and the presidency, and they really want a particular agency to have certain powers, maybe when they actually legislate it and they take it through the normal process, they make it a bill, then they make it a law, so on and so forth, and they actually give a wide breadth and they allow it through legislation, not just through de facto giving up the power, but actually explicitly stating they have this wide swath of powers, that makes it a lot harder for the Supreme Court to challenge. So in doing this, in saying, hey, it needs to be explicitly laid out by the legislator, yes, they're trying to take some of that power back. And when I say take back, give back that power to the legislator. They're saying, no, you can't just be an agency that basically has the power to create its own laws and then enforce its own laws. It's too much power vested in one place. But then, if the legislator really wants something to get done, they could end up making it completely legal to give all of this power to those administrative or executive agencies because they're trying to be in compliance with the Supreme Court rule. And I think that could be a overstep that comes about from this, because people in the legislature, they don't want to have to address all of these issues all the time. They just want to be able to hand it off to the executive and say, hey, you got this agency to handle these specific things. It's basically a giant task force. There's a giant committee. We have all our experts on one given subject there. They can handle it. And they may end up giving away too much power. And guess what? If the Supreme Court is saying, hey, it needs to be explicitly stated here, at least during the duration of this court, it's going to be very hard to overturn a rule that would come from one of these agencies that has been given explicit legislative power, whether that be a law passed by either party, and state, oh, well, actually, no, now that's even not constitutional because of this procedure or another. It's going to be very hard to argue that, well, hey, the legislative did give us this executive power. They explicitly stated where we're allowed to do this now. And you can't really push back. Like, you kind of got to go with it because you made this ruling less than, 10 years ago. So I think there's room here for it to go awry and for it to go wrong. So keep your eye on it. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe in 20 years, everything is perfectly balanced. Both sides are absolutely afraid the other one's going to get into power after them, and they will not go over their bounds. They will make sure that everything is within the Overton window, that everybody is checked properly. No, I'm just kidding. Maybe in an ideal world that will happen. People are fallible. They believe that their party will keep on winning, so they're not worried about repercussions afterwards. And eventually someone is going to have all three chambers of the government. They are going to make an agency, and maybe it's not in my lifetime, but because of this precedent, they'll make an agency that is vested with way too much power, and it's going to be a lot harder for the Supreme Court to be able to strike it down simply because of a ruling that may go in favor of putting this power back in the legislator, but then the legislator gets a little bit too zealous and basically gives away the plot. We'll see. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm being too doom and gloom. For anybody who doesn't like the administrative state, this is most definitely a win here and now. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't do it because of those fears that I'm mentioning. It's just one of those things that we got to look out for. It's one of those things that you actually genuinely have to consider when you're thinking from a political strategy standpoint rather than from the standpoint of, hey, expediency, let me get what I want now. So, with all that said, let's jump to our final article that comes from the American Prospect. And the headline reads, Transportation Department's New Path. So, for those of you who have not kept up with the Transportation Department, I am one of you. And I don't think anybody has, because after the huge incident that happened in Ohio, and then also the plane delays that happened 2 major holidays in a row. I mean, like Buttigieg has just kind of been in the background. He hasn't been doing too much. They're not trying to run him out there for all these different infrastructure deals that he's doing. And that's interesting to me because there are lots of different infrastructure deals that Biden is doing, and Biden has been out there on the road. But if there's anybody to do it, it is his Secretary of Transportation. And I think Pete Buttigieg kind of got painted as an inept Department of Transportation secretary after the Southwest cancellation issues and after the JetBlue and Spirit debacle. So I think he's been, I don't want to say tarred and feathered, but he has definitely had a lot of things on his plate that do not look good for him whatsoever. And when you want to promote these giant achievements that you've made in infrastructure across the nation, and your main advocate that would be talking about it can't go out there without possibly getting a few boos, it does not look good for you whatsoever. But there is a new strategy underway here. Quote, on Wednesday, Buttigieg announced that airlines will be required to give passengers automatic full cash refunds whenever flights are canceled or significantly delayed, when checked bags do not show up in a timely manner, or when Wi-Fi or other services purchased on the flight are not delivered. If these new rules work, they would relieve travelers from the customer service I'm not going to say that word, the heck they experience whenever trying to obtain compensation from airlines. Up to now, thwarted passengers would often get travel vouchers instead of cash, which would prevent them from rebooking elsewhere. So, why is this actually important? And there are lots of other things here. Cutting down on junk fees, it's been one of Biden's talking points for quite some time. And, credit to him. It's not just a talking point. He is actually going on and he is doing what he said he was going to do. Respect for him. Would this be the way that I'm doing it? Not necessarily, but at the end of the day, it is his administration. He is sticking to his word. Pete Buttigieg says they're going to try to cut down on junk fees. They're going to try to empower the consumer. This is something that hits people every day, or at least once a year when they're going flying and something happens. Something inevitably happens. This hits every single consumer. And I think if you're going to make any strategic move in any direction that's pro-consumer, rather than going after the big corporations as, going for, what's the word I'm looking for, shrinkflation, which sure is actually something that's happening. I've experienced it myself with some of the favorite brands that I have, like protein cookie wise. I'm looking at them like, this is definitely smaller. Even though the packaging's bigger, the contents have changed a little bit. The nutrient information has changed. They might be using cheaper products. It's all at least real to some degree. I'm not trying to hate on that idea, but it doesn't resonate with people as much. Maybe they see it, they just don't care. But this is something when, you're already shelling out a lot of money to go on these different trips and they give you a voucher rather than a cash reimbursement. You're like, well, when am I going to use this voucher? I don't care about that. I want the cash back now so I could try to put it towards another flight right now that is not on the same airline, because maybe instead of a flight that leaves at 7 a.m. in the morning the next day with the same airline that you just booked, maybe there's one that leaves in an hour and you can do a rapid booking with Delta right there at the customer service desk. I don't know. So it's one of those things where it's kind of a ease of life kind of thing. And whether or not I absolutely love it, whether or not I think the government should be getting directly involved here versus the people who are signing a giant petition and yelling at Southwest or all these other airlines to do it, hey, he's getting it done. And if he can make this spin work and actually have Buttigieg come out looking friendly afterwards, then I think it could be a new path forward for the Department of Transportation. Now, is it going to work out that way? Is he going to be able to get past some of the terrible things that have happened under his administration? No, I don't necessarily think so. I don't think Pete Buttigieg has a political career after his time in the Biden administration, but hey, maybe I'm wrong. He's young. He was a rising star at one point. Maybe he'll be able to really tout his record. I just don't see it happening. So with all that said, let's jump into our Twitter tirade. Twitter tirade. Oh, whew, wow. Alex, you are all over the place today. Let's jump into our Daily Delight. This one comes from Parade Pets. The headline reads, tiny pug refuses to go inside for bed just like a human child. And I'll tell you now, this video is definitely reminds me of when I was babysitting back in the day, some of the kids I had to deal with, like, no, mom's not coming back for a while. I don't care. I want to read this. I want to do that. Yeah, it definitely reminds me of any excuse in order to not go to bed. And this pug is definitely doing the same thing. Maybe even getting a little bit of the zoomies. I don't necessarily like that term, but important people around me use that term, and it's kind of stuck in my mind a little bit there. So if you want to check out this cute video or photo or the article, or you want to read any of today's articles, they'll all be linked in the description below that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Google Podcasts, Podvine, as well as the Twitter handle @YourDailyFlip, where I do post that Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. So with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.